Welcome to the Thrive College podcast. I'm Dina Davidson, host of the podcast and the discipleship director at Thrive College. And today in the studio, we have Dr. John Marriott. Everyone give it up. Woo!
Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad you're here. You are a professor at Biola University. You teach philosophy classes, which is right up my favorite alley. Love me some philosophy. And you are the author of 5 books on why people deconvert from the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And that was actually, I love this. I don't even know if people know what a dissertation is. Basically, you go through this really long process where you become an expert in something. And what you are an expert on is why people deconvert from Christianity to atheism.
Yes.
I love that. Why did you choose that? I didn't even brief you on this question, sir,
what?
But hey, this is a great question.
I had someone in my life who was a really rock solid Christian, who had sacrificed a lot, sacrificed going to the Olympics, sacrificed going to a world championships in the field of track and field because he felt like he couldn't compete on Sunday because he felt as though that would be unfaithful to the Lord. So this guy was really committed and showed all the fruit of being a genuine follower of Jesus. And then at one point later in his life, I was looking him up online and found out that he had left the faith. And he said that not only had he left the faith, he was happier and more settled in himself after leaving. And so I thought, wow, why would that happen? And I looked into him and found out for every sort of celebrity Christian who leaves the faith, there's probably 10,000 more non-celebrity Christians who are just walking away or drifting away, but in one form or another saying, I just don't identify as a Christian anymore. And I said, why is this happening? And is there anything we can do to kind of mitigate it?
Wow. That is so crazy. And that's honestly why we wanted to have this conversation with you is I think all of us has that friend and that type of story where there's someone that we knew who was walking alongside Christ. And then all of a sudden one day, we would say lost their faith, but for them, they found truth. And so we want to better understand and know kind of what's going on and the role we might play. And is there anything we can do to win them back or maybe just even better understand why they left in the first place? But before we dive into that conversation, we have 2 really amazing guests in our studio who are students in our program. So Lucas, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Lucas. I intern in high school ministry, and I just hope one day to be working full-time in ministry, lead pastor, wherever they have me.
Love it. Very cool. And Macy?
I'm Macy. I'm a Thrive College student. I intern with the special needs ministry, and I would love to stay in ministry and just become a good communicator one day.
Love it. Perfect.
Great.
Well, Dr. Marriott, we have some rapid fire questions. Where were you born? Where do you live now? And what is one thing from your youth you wish more people knew?
Okay. I was born in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, wow.
Which is on the northern tip of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. You just go over the border and you're in Canada. And so that's where I grew up. We like to say that it's about 9 months of good ice fishing up there and about 3 months of so-so ice fishing up there.
Oh my
It's very cold, lots of snow. And so that's where I grew up. I live now in the city of Pico Rivera, which is just about 15 miles southeast of downtown Los Angeles. Okay. And the one thing that people don't know about me growing up was that almost every day in elementary school, I used to get in a fight on the way home from school with the school bully.
Oh.
And then I would get home and I would say, Mom, it happened again. And my mom would say, oh, John, I'm sure she just likes me. And I said, but Mom, she's punching me all the time. That's a funny way to show that she really likes me. So yes, the book Diary of a Wimpy Kid is sort of based on my elementary school life.
Oh my gosh, that is so funny. Okay, who even knew? Well, all right. Well, I can't get that visual out of my head, to be totally honest. Can you tell me what color of hair she had?
Black.
Okay. It's like, that was so quick.
You want me to tell you her name?
Yeah.
Give you her address?
No.
Maybe
Let's
some of our
keep
listeners
that
can
private, follow up, check in on her, show her some not love. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was actually really amazing. So here on this podcast, we are all about empowering the next generation of Christian leaders. And that's why every episode we pass the mic to them so they get to ask the questions.
That's great.
So Macy, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So I don't want to lose my faith. So what are some of the ways that I can prepare myself for the challenges that I might come across when it comes to deconverting from my faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing I would say is that it's really important that you've already decided. You say, look, I don't want to lose my faith. And this is deeply important to me and I care about it. And I think that reveals where your heart is at. And if someone's heart is directed towards the Lord and say, hey, I really want to remain faithful to you, Lord, I'm really convinced that he will allow you to do that. And I think that he'll put people in your life and give you the resources to do that. But practically speaking, some of the things that you can do are one is continually to deepen and develop your spiritual life, for sure, right? That Christianity is far more than just identifying as a Christian as a label, as you know, but it's it's discipleship, an apprentice to following Jesus as the King. And so always cultivating that, I think, is the foundation. But moving on from there, I think it's important to remain in community, right, with other Christians who will continually support and build you up. And one of the reasons for that is because sociologists and sometimes philosophers talk about what's called a plausibility structure. And that is that we're all in various groups, and being in those groups either reinforces or detracts from some of the things that we believe. Mm-hmm. And we're in a culture that is the plausibility structure that says to us, I'm not really sure that this Christian faith is really reasonable to hold to, if it's even plausible and likely. In fact, it's probably more of a negative influence on the world, and that just shows it's also probably not even true. We're always kind of being squeezed and shaped into that. So you need to find a counterculture that will squeeze and form and shape you in a different way. And the church really is that. And so I would start off by saying, tend to your spiritual life, remain in a community that's encouraging and supportive. And then also, I think it's really important to have an intellectual foundation, not a foundation, but maybe at least the second story of your faith needs to be able to say, here's what I believe and here's why I believe it. Mm-hmm. You don't need to have a PhD in apologetics or philosophy, but you need to have at least enough questions answered that you can say, I'm willing to take a step and follow Jesus in the daily routines of my life. Even though I'm not 100% sure of everything, mm-hmm. Right. I don't have absolute certainty, but I have enough reasons to think that it's true, that it's a hope worth acting on.
That's good.
And then when you do encounter challenges, especially if they're intellectual challenges, which are easy to come by on the internet. The internet has allowed 1,000 atheist apologists to bloom.
Yeah.
And sometimes we come across those and we say, I never knew that before. Why hasn't anyone told me that? Do I really believe the truth? Mm-hmm. I think it's really important just to pause and take a deep breath when you hear those things. And then to say, all right, the internet is not the place for these really complex questions to get answered. But I do think that I want to pursue this. Here's my question. And I'm going to look to some really good authorities, and I'm going to start out within my community to do that, and then broadly expand outwards to some of the resources that the broader church has. So in doing that, then I think that you don't get overwhelmed by looking at, what about the existence of evil? And then what about the reliability of the Bible? And what about all the violence in the Old Testament? And is God really anti all of these things? Yeah. But if you just work through them and don't work through them alone, but find a group of people that you can say, hey, I'm wrestling with this. What do you think about it? I think those are the kinds of things that will help you maintain faith.
So
that's good.
Those are really good. Yeah.
I just want to emphasize, you said, go through the things, but don't go through them alone. So don't shy away from those questions. If you just try, I think what you're saying is, like, if you just try to sweep those questions under the rug, they'll kind of haunt you throughout the course of Christianity. But if you are willing to tackle those questions not alone, but in the context of a church that is willing to come alongside you and point you towards truth, and hopefully some friends that are willing to have some hard conversations with you where you're really wrestling, that is the pathway forward.
Do you mind if I share a very quick story?
Of course.
I just read a story of a woman who was a Christian for 35 years. She married a young man who she met at Bible college. They went off to pastor a church together. Mm-hmm. And now she says, look, I don't believe anymore. And it started when I was 5 years old. Wow. And she said, I had certain questions. But then she said, but I never fully believed 100%. Oh, and so if you're not 100% certain, then you're not really a believer. And so I guess I was never really truly a believer because I didn't have the kind of certainty that I sought after.
Wow.
And after 35 years, I finally got the courage to say, I have doubts, which makes me not a Christian. And I read that and I just thought how tragic that she has such a misunderstanding of what it means to believe, and that she could not express those doubts or questions without fear of either being shamed or that she was being someone who was revealed to have a weak faith.
Yeah.
And eventually it ended up costing her her faith.
I think about the father, I think of a demon-possessed daughter or son. It's something, some story in the Bible where a father's coming to Jesus and asking him for something. Yeah. And he says, do this if you can. And I think it's healing. Heal him if you can. And Jesus says, if you can. And then the man says, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Right. Yep. And you don't need certainty to be a Christian. You need faith. Faith is what we have in the absence of certainty. So very helpful.
Yep. That's really good. Yeah.
Lucas?
Yeah. So we've been using the words like deconstructing, deconversion. For those who don't know, what is deconstruction and why are so many people deconstructing their faith?
Yeah, that's another really good and timely question. Well, let me compare deconstruction to deconversion. Someone deconverts when they say, I don't believe this anymore. I'm undoing everything I did years ago. I reject it and don't think it's true. I don't fellowship in a Christian community anymore. And I got rid of the label. Mm-hmm. So I've unconverted. I've deconverted. Yeah. But deconstruction is a little bit different. And it depends on who you're talking to. And it depends on what they mean, because it means all kinds of different things to all kinds of different people, none of which Jacques Derrida, the French linguist philosopher who coined the term years ago in the 1960s, meant. So there's a lot of confusion around the term. And that's because no one uses it the same way. But generally what it means is this. I've been handed this tradition, and I assumed that it was unadorned Christianity that just fell from the sky. Yeah. But now I realize that it's part of I live in America. I live at the beginning of the 21st century. I come from this denomination and this particular sort of area of the denomination. The Christianity that I hold is not just like pure Christianity simpliciter. It is, in a way, an interpretation of the Bible. And you know what? I'm not even sure that it really is an accurate one. Mm-hmm. Now, here's where sort of deconstruction diverges. You either have the person who says, I believe that Jesus is the way, but I'm not sure I know what the way of Jesus is supposed to look like. Mm-hmm. So I want to be faithful to Jesus, and I want his word to be the final authority. So I'm going to put all of my Christian beliefs on the table, sort of take apart the house of faith in a way, and lay them on the ground. And then I'm going to rebuild the faith in a way that I think looks more like what the Bible says it should look like. But then there are other folks who will say, I have all of these problems, but I'm not going to use the Bible as my authority to rebuild the faith. Mm-hmm. I'm going to stand in judgment of the text and say, I think that the Bible is authoritative here and here, but I don't really think it's authoritative here. I don't think maybe God said this or God is for that. And usually the criterion that they're using is maybe their modern moral sensibilities, or maybe a science as a criterion, or something else that is the authority for them. Yeah. In many cases, people who head down that road, deconstruction does become deconversion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't end in deconversion, it ends in a faith that looks very little like the historic Orthodox understanding of Christianity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so deconstruction can go bad. Mm-hmm. But deconstruction doesn't have to go bad, right? I think that you can come out of it with a healthier faith, a stronger faith, a faith that is within the Orthodox tradition, and maybe one that aligns maybe a little bit more where you're at. And it's not like going into Baskin & Robbins where there's 31 different flavors that you can pick from whatever you like. But I have a great friend who has left our church and gone to another church. And the primary reason is he says, this is a great place. The Bible teaching is fantastic. But you know what? This other place, they really are deeply concerned about social issues that are really on my heart and have been for years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like that's really where I need to be at, because I can really pour in there. Yeah. That's the kind of thing I think deconstruction can help. Mm-hmm. The second part of the question is, why is it so relevant today? Is I think it is unique. When I was your age, I was told, here's Christianity, take it or leave it. I never would have said, I think I'll take it and take it apart and look at it and see which pieces line up with my values and then put it back together. Mm-hmm. This is uniquely a Gen Z millennial phenomenon. And I think part of it has to do with, we've really gone through a change in sometimes what people call the self. Mm-hmm. We see ourselves now as, for various social conditions, not beholden to any narrative that's above and beyond us that we need to, like truth is not outside of us necessarily that we discover. But it's something that we have to determine in a way on our own. Now, as Christians, we would say that's not true. Mm-hmm. but yet that still seeps into us and we internalize it to a large degree.
Yeah.
And we come to our faith with it and we say, well, if this doesn't fit my values and I have to live my truth, I have to speak my truth, you do you, you be you, then there is this impulse. In the same way that birds have an impulse to fly south in the wintertime, young people and others on the shoulders of being a young person, like the shoulder, areas, are saying, yeah, what? I'm not sure this is really authentically who I am. And the primary value of our time is freedom to be authentically who we are. Yeah. And that's a big concern, right? Because that's not something in the history of the church anyone was really concerned with, being authentically who they were. Yeah. Because the determination of what it means to be authentic is to just live in line with how you feel. Your feelings, your psychological well-being and your feelings are those criteria. Right. You can't be forced in any other way to conform yourself to anything outside of you. And for that reason, I think that, and more, and for others, but I think that's a primary motivator in all of this. Yeah,
that's really good. I had a follow-up question. You talk about how there's good deconstruction and there's bad deconstruction. If you are deconstructing your faith, how do you approach it in a safe way where you're not going to just reject everything and not pick out the little things that you like? How do you have a healthy deconstruction of your faith?
That's a really great question because, and I hate shameless self-promotion, but I have a book coming out. Sean McDowell and myself, another professor at Biola, have written a book called Set Adrift, How to Deconstruct What You Believe Without Sinking Your Faith.
Wow, that's perfect.
We're trying not to tell people what to believe so much as saying, here's how you should rethink because you're in the process of doing it anyway. Yeah. So we lay out a few principles, and the first one we say is, you have to be aware that there's two roads that you can go. If you're going to head down the deconstructing road, then the first thing you need to do is you need to set a foundation. And there's no other foundation if you want to end up being a Christian than that Jesus is Lord. Yeah. He has to be the foundation. You can take apart the house of faith in a lot of different ways and reassemble it, but you can't destroy the foundation. And because if you do, you end up in theological quicksand. Yeah. Right. So Jesus has to be Lord. And what that looks like is at least desiring and intending to obey what he has to say. Now, we find that in his word, and people disagree and differ over what his word actually says. But at least at the very beginning, you need to decide whether or not you're going to allow Jesus to be Lord and his word to be the means by which you guide your life. The second thing we would say is that you need to live within certain boundary markers and fence posts. And those fence posts are healthy, right? We talk about like free range chickens and things like today. That's good for them. They can run around and they get exercise, and it's good for us when we eat them. But they can't run around forever because otherwise they'll run off the farm and they'll be eaten by wolves. There have to be some fences that they live within, right? So I think that the historic creeds of the church, like Nicene, the Apostles' Creed, these are really broad fence posts that say, hey, within the fence posts, you can rethink all kinds of things, but don't go beyond these, because if you do, you are outside of being theologically considered a Christian. And if you get further away from being theologically a Christian, then you start to, your eternal salvation is starting to be jeopardized because, well, believing in that Jesus is divine is not necessary for salvation, and believing that God is triune is not necessary for salvation. But denying those things, then maybe you're believing in a different Jesus and a different God, and neither of those will save you. Exactly. Right. So that's important. The third thing would be to ask who is your authority. All right. At the end of the day, when you pick up the Bible, are you willing to say, all right, I am going to let this be the thing which guides me? Or am I going to say, I'm going to stand in judgment on it? Now, we all come to the Bible with presuppositions, and we all have to interpret the Bible. Therefore, someone might be listening and saying, well, then that means I'm the ultimate authority because I'm the one doing the interpreting, right? Fair enough. But I think we need to come and say, I'm going to do my best to read what's there. I'm going to try and do it with using good hermeneutical principles, and I'm going to try and not find other ways to get around what the Bible seems to teach. I think being aware of the culture that we live in that is squeezing you and pushing you in that way, and also that there is a tendency to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Be careful of doing that, right? In the evangelical world, there is a lot of bad press, and we'll call it big E evangelicalism, that gets tied to a lot of political things that are messy and sometimes very ugly. And so sometimes people say, I don't want to be an evangelical Christian. I don't want to be conservative because if it means I have to do this and believe this. And again, that's fair enough. But know that in getting rid of that, you don't want to get rid of all of the good stuff that has come along with that.
For sure.
Right. And so I don't think it's important that you identify as evangelical as a label, but I think that the historic things that have identified an evangelical, such as having a very high view of the Bible, having a kind of conversion moment, the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus is incredibly important. Social activism has historically been important with being an evangelical as well. So those, and missions, getting out and evangelizing the world. Those things are really kind of the heart and the core of following Jesus, not necessarily the label that you carry.
So good.
So good.
I just want to say, for all of us listening, Dr. John Marriott just dropped about 1,000 pounds of truth and wisdom on us.
Yes.
So this is an episode to be listened to be re-listened to be shared with your friends and discussed. If you guys are encountering similar challenges and problems and you're trying to deconstruct in healthy ways, listen, re-listen, and discuss with that community of faith that Dr. Marriott was talking about.
Yeah. And if anyone needs to reach out and contact me, they can do through my website.
Perfect.
It's either losingmyfaith.org or johnmarriott.org.
Okay, you choose.
Yeah. And there's some resources there for people who are trying to understand why this takes place. Yeah. And then for people who are saying, I don't want it to happen in my life. What can I do?
Love it.
I'm struggling with doubt. I have all these kinds of questions.
Yeah. I've only known you, Dr. Marriott, for about a year, but in that year, I have been so impressed just by how personal this is for you. You're always sharing stories of actual people who are deconverting and wrestling with the more challenging questions of their faith. And this is not just heady stuff to you. This is very real world. This person whose name I know, whose kids I know, this is what they're walking through, and I'm walking it through with them. So thank you for investing into us.
Yeah,
you're
thank you
welcome.
so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
We have one more question that we always ask. It's like a bonus question. If you could say one thing to a young Christian leader, what would you say?
That God is faithful. That he may not come through in the ways that you want him to come through. That you may dedicate your life to him. And when you want something and you're expecting him to give it to you, he may not. Give him the benefit of the doubt in those times. Because in hindsight, you'll see that he was faithful despite in the moment when it seems like he's maybe hiding somewhere.
Wow.
So good.
That's really good.
Well, I know Lucas, Macy, myself, and hopefully everyone that gets to receive this content, we're going to be thinking about this conversation for such a long time. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Marriott.
Anytime.
Thank you for joining us today on the Thrive College podcast. We hope that today's episode has empowered you to navigate the challenges and the opportunities of your future and your faith. If you really enjoyed our conversation today and appreciated what we had to offer, we would love for you to write a 5-star written review and share it with your friends. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.